The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Clarence's house as Camilla Parker Bowles stood by the tall windows of her private sitting room. Her fingers drummed nervously against the polished wooden sill as she watched the groundskeepers tend to the roses that Charles loved so much. Despite the peaceful scene outside, turmoil churned within her chest like a storm gathering strength. For months now, she had been dreading this day. Princess and Charles's sister had announced her intention to visit for what she called a family discussion. Camilla knew better. This wasn't going to be a pleasant social call filled with afternoon tea and polite conversation about the weather. This was going to be a confrontation, and Camilla felt utterly unprepared for what lay ahead. The relationship between Camilla and Princess had never been warm. From the very beginning, when Charles first introduced Camilla as the woman he loved, and had maintained a cool distance. It wasn't open hostility exactly, but rather a carefully controlled politeness that spoke volumes about his true feelings. The Princess Royal had always been fiercely protective of her family, particularly of Charles, and she had never fully accepted Camilla's place in their lives. Camilla understood Anne's reservations, even if they stung. She knew that in Anne's eyes, she would always be the other woman, the person who had complicated Charles's life during his marriage to Diana. No matter how many years had passed, no matter how happy she and Charles were together now, that shadow from the past seemed to follow her everywhere. As she stood there lost in thought, Camilla heard the familiar sound of Charles's footsteps approaching down the hallway. Even after all these years together, his presence still brought her comfort. She turned from the window and watched as he entered the room, his face lighting up with the gentle smile that had first captured her heart decades ago. "Good morning, my darling," Charles said softly, crossing the room to place a tender kiss on her cheek. "You're up early today. Couldn't sleep?" Camilla forced a smile, not wanting to burden him with her worries. "I was just enjoying the morning light in the garden. It's particularly beautiful today, don't you think?" Charles followed her gaze out the window, but she could see the concern in his eyes. He knew her too well to be fooled by her casual tone. After so many years together, they had developed an almost telepathic connection, able to sense each other's moods and emotions without the need for words. "And we'll be here this afternoon," he said gently, his voice carrying a note of apprehension that matched her own feelings. She mentioned wanting to discuss some family matters. "I'm not entirely sure what's on her mind, but you know how she can be when she gets an idea in her head." Camilla nodded, her stomach tightening at the mention of the visit. She had been hoping against hope that Charles might have forgotten about it, or that it might have changed her plans. But, deep down, she knew that Princess was not the type of person to cancel important meetings or avoid difficult conversations. "I'm sure we'll be fine," Camilla replied, though her voice lacked conviction. Perhaps she simply wants to catch up on family news or discuss some upcoming engagements. Charles studied her face carefully, and she could see that he wasn't convinced by her attempt at optimism. He moved closer and took her hands in his touch warm and reassuring despite the anxiety that seemed to fill the room. "Camilla, if there's something troubling you about his visit, please tell me. We're in this together, remember? Whatever concerns you concerns me as well." For a moment, Camilla considered telling him everything. She wanted to explain how isolated and unwelcome and often made her feel, how every family gathering became a delicate balance of trying to prove herself worthy of their acceptance. She wanted to share her fears about what Anne might say or do during this visit, and how powerless she felt to defend herself against the Princess Royal's disapproval. But, looking into Charles's kind eyes, she couldn't bring herself to add to his burdens. He already carried so much responsibility, so much pressure from his royal duties and family obligations. The last thing she wanted was to create more tension or force him to choose sides between the two women he cared about most. "I'm just being silly," she said with a forced laugh. "You know how I can overthink things sometimes. I'm sure, and I will get along just fine." Charles squeezed her hands gently, but she could see that he wasn't entirely satisfied with her response. He opened his mouth as if to say something more, but was interrupted by the sound of his private secretary approaching with the morning briefings and correspondence. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of routine activities. Charles attended to his correspondence and reviewed his upcoming schedule, while Camilla tried to occupy herself with various household matters. She rearranged flowers that didn't need rearranging, reviewed menus that had already been approved, and found herself checking the clock repeatedly as the afternoon approached. By noon, her nerves had reached a breaking point. She excused herself from lunch, claiming a slight headache, and retreated to her bedroom to gather her thoughts. Standing before her mirror, she studied her reflection critically, wondering if she looked presentable enough for what was sure to be a challenging encounter. Camilla had always been aware that she wasn't the fairy tale princess that many people had expected Charles to marry. She wasn't young and glamorous like Diana had been, nor did she possess the natural regal bearing that seemed to come so effortlessly to Anne. She was simply herself, a woman who loved Charles deeply and tried her best to support him in his royal duties. But would that ever be enough for his family? As she applied a fresh coat of lipstick and smoothed down her hair, Camilla found herself thinking back to all the small moments over the years when Anne's disapproval had been made clear. The cool nods at public events, the way conversations seemed to die when she entered a room, the careful distance that Anne maintained during family photographs. It wasn't that Anne was ever openly rude or hostile. The Princess Royal was far too well-bred and conscious of royal protocol for such obvious displays of displeasure. Instead, her disapproval came in subtle forms: a lack of warmth in her greeting, an absence of inclusion in family discussions, a general sense that Camilla was tolerated rather than welcomed. The sound of car tires on gravel drew her attention to the window. Looking down, she saw a familiar Range Rover pulling up to the main entrance. Princess Anne had arrived, and there was no more time for anxiety or preparation. Taking a deep breath, Camilla made her way downstairs to join Charles in the drawing room, where they would receive his sister. She found him standing near the fireplace, adjusting his tie nervously, a gesture that revealed his own apprehension about the upcoming meeting. "She's here," Camilla said quietly, settling into her usual chair and smoothing her skirt with hands that trembled slightly. Charles nodded and moved to stand behind her chair, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Whatever this is about, we'll face it together," he murmured, his voice filled with the determination and love that had sustained their relationship through so many challenges. The butler announced Princess Anne's arrival, and moments later, the Princess Royal herself entered the room and looked every inch the confident royal she was, dressed in a practical but elegant outfit that somehow managed to be both casual and commanding. Her sharp eyes took in the scene before her, Charles standing protectively near Camilla, the obvious tension in the air, the careful way everyone was positioned. "Charles," and said warmly, moving forward to greet her brother with genuine affection. The love between the royal siblings was evident, even amid the current tension. "You look well. The country air seems to be agreeing with you." And Charles replied, embracing his sister briefly, "Thank you for making the time to visit. I know how busy your schedule has been lately." Anne's gaze then shifted to Camilla, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "Camilla," she said with a polite nod that somehow managed to convey both acknowledgement and distance. "Your Royal Highness," Camilla responded formally, rising from her chair to offer a small curtsy. The gesture felt awkward and forced, a reminder of the complex dynamics that governed their relationship. "Please, let's dispense with the formalities," Anne said, though her tone suggested this was more of a command than a request. "We have important matters to discuss, and I prefer to speak plainly." Charles gestured toward the seating area, and they all settled into their respective chairs. The butler appeared with tea service, but the elegant china and delicate sandwiches seemed absurdly out of place given the tension that filled the room. "I suppose you're wondering why I've asked for this meeting," and began, her directness characteristic of her no-nonsense personality. "There are some concerns that need to be addressed, and I believe it's better to discuss them openly rather than allow misunderstandings to fester. Camilla felt her heart rate increase, but she tried to maintain an expression of calm interest. Beside her, Charles sat forward slightly, his protective instincts clearly engaged. "What kind of concerns?" Charles asked, his voice carefully controlled, but with an underlying edge that suggested he was prepared to defend his wife if necessary, and paused for a moment, seeming to choose her words carefully. "There have been discussions within the family about upcoming events and responsibilities. Some people have expressed opinions about how certain situations should be handled, and I felt it was important to share these perspectives with you both." The vagueness of Anne's words only increased the tension in the room. Camilla found herself gripping the arms of her chair, waiting for the other shoe to drop. She had learned over the years that royal conversations often contained layers of meaning, with important messages hidden beneath diplomatic language. "I think it would be helpful if you could be more specific," Charles said, his tone becoming noticeably cooler. "Camilla and I have always tried to fulfill our duties responsibly, and we're certainly open to feedback. But vague concerns don't give us much to work with." Anne's eyes flicked between her brother and Camilla, and for a moment, something almost like regret seemed to cross her features. But the expression was gone so quickly that Camilla wondered if she had imagined it. "Very well," Anne said, settling back in her chair with the air of someone preparing for battle. "Let me be direct then. There are those within our circle who believe that certain upcoming events might be better handled with a more traditional approach to representation." The diplomatic language couldn't hide the real message, and Camilla felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. She was being told, in the politest possible terms, that she wasn't wanted at some future royal function. The specific nature of her exclusion didn't matter as much as the underlying message, that despite her marriage to Charles, despite her years of service and dedication, she was still considered an outsider by important members of his family. The silence that followed Anne's statement stretched uncomfortably long. Charles's face had gone very still, and Camilla could practically feel the anger radiating from him. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but filled with barely controlled emotion. "And who exactly has been expressing these opinions?" he asked, each word carefully enunciated, and seemed to realize that she had perhaps pushed too far, too quickly. "Charles, please understand that this isn't personal. It's simply a matter of what some people believe would be most appropriate given the circumstances." "Everything about this is personal," Charles replied sharply. "You're talking about my wife, and you're suggesting that she shouldn't participate in events that are rightfully hers to attend. How is that not personal?" The conversation was escalating quickly beyond what any of them had expected. Camilla found herself caught between wanting to defend herself and wanted to prevent a serious rift from developing between Charles and his sister. The family had already endured so much division and pain over the years, and the last thing she wanted was to be the cause of more conflict. "Perhaps," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "we could discuss this more specifically. If there are particular events or concerns, maybe we could address them individually rather than speaking in generalities." Both Charles and Anne turned to look at her, and she could see surprise in both their faces. Charles seemed surprised that she was willing to engage with what was clearly an attack on her position, while Anne appeared surprised that Camilla was speaking up at all rather than simply accepting whatever decisions had been made about her. "That's a reasonable suggestion," Anne said after a moment, though her tone remained cautious. "There is one upcoming event in particular that has generated some discussion." As Anne began to explain the specific situation that had prompted this visit, Camilla found herself studying the Princess Royal's face for any sign of the motivation behind this confrontation. Was this truly about protocol and appropriateness, or was it something deeper? Was Anne finally expressing years of accumulated resentment and disapproval, or was she genuinely trying to protect the family from some perceived threat to their reputation? Whatever the answer, Camilla knew that this conversation would mark a turning point in their relationship. The careful politeness that had characterized their interactions for so long was being stripped away, replaced by a frank discussion that would either clear the air between them or create a permanent divide. Asin continued speaking, outlining the concerns and suggestions that had apparently been circulating among certain family members. Camilla felt a strange sense of relief mixed with her anxiety. At least now she knew where she stood. The uncertainty and second-guessing that had plagued her for so long were being replaced by a clear understanding of the challenges she faced. The question was, what would she do with this information? And how would Charles react when he learned the full extent of his sister's objections to his wife's role in the royal family? The afternoon light had shifted dramatically by the time and finished explaining her concerns about the upcoming memorial service for their late mother. What had started as vague references to family discussions had evolved into a detailed explanation of how certain influential members of the extended royal family believed Camilla's prominent role in the ceremony might be inappropriate. Camilla sat motionless in her chair, feeling as though she were watching someone else's life unfold before her. The memorial service was meant to honor the Queen Mother's legacy and bring the family together in remembrance. The idea that her presence could somehow diminish or complicate such a sacred occasion felt like a physical blow. "Let me understand this correctly," Charles said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You're suggesting that my wife should not participate fully in a memorial service for our mother because some unnamed family members think it might be inappropriate?" And shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Throughout their conversation, she had maintained her characteristic directness, but now something in Charles's tone seemed to give her pause. "Charles, I'm simply the messenger here. These concerns have been raised, and I felt it was my responsibility to discuss them with you before any decisions were finalized." "Decisions?" Charles stood abruptly, moving to the fireplace where he gripped the mantle with both hands. "What decisions? When did memorial services for our mother become subject to committee approval about who is worthy to attend?" The pain in his voice was evident, and Camilla felt her heart breaking for him. She knew how much the Queen Mother had meant to Charles, how her loss had affected him deeply. The idea that politics and family tensions were now intruding on his grief seemed almost cruel. "Your Highness," Camilla said carefully, addressing and directly for the first time since the conversation had begun in earnest. "Perhaps you could help me understand the specific concerns. If there are aspects of my participation that might be problematic, I would rather know exactly what they are than continue to speculate." And studied Camilla's face for a long moment, and something flickered in her expression that might have been respect. "Very well. There are those who believe that given the circumstances of your relationship with Charles during his first marriage, your prominent presence at such a significant family occasion might overshadow the intended focus on remembering our mother." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Camilla had expected this conversation to be difficult, but hearing her past laid out so bluntly still had the power to wound. After all these years, after everything she and Charles had built together, she was still being defined by the painful period when their love had existed in the shadows. "I see," Camilla replied quietly. "And what level of participation would be considered appropriate?" Charles turned from the fireplace, his face flushed with anger. "This is absolutely ridiculous, Camilla. You don't need to negotiate the terms of your own acceptance in this family." "Charles, please," and interjected, raising her hand in a gesture that sought to calm her brother's rising temper. "This isn't about acceptance or rejection. It's about finding a way to honor our mother's memory while being sensitive to the various perspectives within our extended family." "Sensitive to which perspectives?" Charles demanded. "Are we talking about cousins who barely knew mother? Distant relatives who show up for major occasions, but haven't contributed anything meaningful to this family in decades? Exactly whose sensitivities are we prioritizing here?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. She had clearly prepared for resistance, but perhaps not for such pointed inquiries about the source of the objections. For the first time since her arrival, she appeared genuinely uncomfortable. "The specific individuals aren't really the point," she said carefully. What matters is that there are legitimate concerns about how the public and media might interpret certain aspects of the ceremony. Camilla found herself studying Anne's face intently, searching for clues about what wasn't being said. The mention of public perception and media coverage suggested that this went beyond simple family preferences. Someone was worried about how the optics of the memorial service might affect the royal family's reputation. And Charles said, returning to his seat but maintaining his intense focus on his sister, "I need you to be completely honest with me. Is this really about unnamed family members and their sensitivities, or is there pressure coming from somewhere else?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Anne's carefully composed expression faltered slightly, revealing a glimpse of the internal conflict she was experiencing. Camilla realized that the Princess Royal was caught between her loyalty to her brother and her sense of duty to the institution they all served. There have been discussions with advisors, and admitted reluctantly. Some people believe that maintaining certain traditional approaches to significant family events helps preserve the dignity and continuity that the public expects from us. Charles leaned back in his chair, and Camilla could see him processing this information. The involvement of advisors and institutional concerns changed the nature of the conversation significantly. This wasn't just about family dynamics anymore. It was about the complex intersection of personal relationships and public duty that defined their lives. "So we're not really talking about family members who have concerns," Charles said slowly. "We're talking about palace advisors who think they know what's best for our family's public image." And silence was answer enough. Camilla felt a strange mixture of relief and frustration. Relief because this wasn't entirely about her personal acceptability within the family, but frustration because it revealed how little control they actually had over their own lives and significant moments. "Your Royal Highness," Camilla said again, her voice stronger now that she better understood the situation. "May I ask what specific role these advisors envision for me in the memorial service?" And seemed grateful for the opportunity to move away from the broader implications of their discussion and focus on practical details. The suggestion was that you might participate in a more private capacity, attending the service, of course, but perhaps not taking a prominent position in the formal proceedings or public portions of the ceremony. The diplomatic language couldn't disguise what was essentially a request for her to make herself less visible during one of the most important family occasions of the year. Camilla felt the familiar sting of being asked to diminish herself for the comfort of others, but this time something was different. This time, she wasn't willing to simply accept whatever decision others made about her life. "And what does my husband think about this suggestion?" she asked, looking directly at Charles. Charles's response was immediate and forceful. "I think it's completely unacceptable. You are my wife, and you will participate in this memorial service in whatever way feels appropriate to both of us. No advisor or distant relative has the right to dictate how we honor my mother's memory." The strength in his voice surprised both women. Anne's eyebrows rose slightly, while Camilla felt a surge of gratitude and love for the man who continued to defend and support her even when it made his own life more complicated. "Charles," and said carefully, "I understand your feelings, but we need to consider the broader implications. The memorial service will receive significant media coverage, and we can't ignore how our choices might be perceived or interpreted." "Then, let's talk about perceptions," Charles replied sharply. "What message does it send when a man's wife is relegated to the shadows during a family memorial service? What does that say about our values and our commitment to the institution of marriage?" The question seemed to catch Anne unprepared. Throughout her adult life, she had navigated royal duties with a clear understanding of protocol and tradition, but Charles was challenging her to think beyond established patterns and consider the human elements of their decisions. Camilla watched this exchange between the siblings with a growing sense of clarity about her own position. For years, she had accepted that her past would always complicate her present, that she would need to constantly prove her worthiness and navigate the sensitivities of others. But sitting here now, listening to Charles defend their marriage and their right to participate fully in family life, she realized that she didn't want to spend the rest of her life apologizing for loving and being loved. Perhaps, she said quietly, interrupting the increasingly heated discussion between Charles and we could approach this differently. Both siblings turned to look at her, and she could see curiosity mixed with concern in their expressions. Taking a deep breath, she continued, rather than debating what others think I should or shouldn't do, maybe we could focus on what would truly honor your mother's memory. What would she have wanted for this service? The question seemed to deflate some of the tension in the room. Anne's expression softened noticeably as she considered the question, while Charles's anger was replaced by a more thoughtful contemplation. Mother always valued family unity above protocol, Charles said after a moment. She believed that genuine love and commitment were more important than following arbitrary rules about appearances, and nodded slowly. And, for the first time since her arrival, she seemed to be considering Camilla as a person rather than as a problem to be managed. She did value authenticity and agreed. Mother never had much patience for pretense or artificial arrangements. Then, perhaps the question isn't whether I should participate prominently or privately, Camilla continued. Perhaps the question is how all of us can participate in a way that genuinely honors her memory and reflects the values she tried to instill in her family. The silence that followed was different from the tense pauses that had punctuated their earlier conversation. This felt more contemplative, as if all three of them were genuinely considering what approach would be most meaningful and appropriate. You raise a valid point, Anne said finally, her tone noticeably warmer than it had been all afternoon. Perhaps we've been so focused on managing perceptions that we've lost sight of what this memorial service is really supposed to accomplish. Charles looked between his wife and his sister, and Camilla could see hope beginning to replace the frustration in his eyes. So, where does that leave us? He asked. How do we move forward from here? Anne was quiet for several minutes, clearly wrestling with competing loyalties and responsibilities. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of determination that suggested she had reached an important decision. I think, she said carefully, that we need to have some additional conversations. Not just among ourselves, but with the people who have been expressing concerns. It's possible that some of these issues can be resolved through better communication and understanding. Camilla felt a cautious optimism beginning to stir within her. This wasn't the complete acceptance she had always hoped for, but it represented something potentially more valuable, a willingness to engage with the underlying issues rather than simply imposing solutions from above. What kind of conversations did you have in mind? Charles asked, though his tone suggested he was prepared to be skeptical about any proposed solutions. I think we need to bring everyone together, family members, advisors, anyone who has expressed concerns, and have an honest discussion about what this memorial service means to all of us, and replied. If we're going to make decisions about protocol and participation, those decisions should be made by people who actually understand the personal significance of what we're doing. The proposal was more reasonable than anything Camilla had expected when this conversation began. It acknowledged the various concerns that had been raised while also insisting that the people most affected by any decisions should have a voice in making them. And you would be willing to advocate for our perspective in those conversations? Charles asked his sister directly and met his gaze steadily. I would be willing to ensure that all perspectives are heard and considered fairly. I can't promise any particular outcome, but I can promise that neither of you will be excluded from decisions that affect your participation in honoring our mother. It wasn't everything Charles and Camilla might have hoped for, but it was significantly more than they had feared when it first arrived. For the first time since the conversation began, Camilla felt like she might actually have some agency in determining how the situation would unfold. That seems like a reasonable approach, she said carefully. When would these conversations take place? I'll need to coordinate with several people's schedules, Anne replied. But I think we could arrange something within the next week or two. Is that acceptable to both of you? Charles looked at Camilla, seeking her approval before committing to anything. She nodded, grateful for his consideration and for the opportunity to have some input into a process that would significantly affect her life. Yes, Charles said firmly. We'll participate in those discussions, and we appreciate your willingness to facilitate them. As the formal portion of their conversation seemed to be concluding, Camilla noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the room. The adversarial tension that had characterized most of their discussion was being replaced by something that felt more collaborative, though still cautious and uncertain. And she said quietly, "May I ask you something directly?" The Princess Royal nodded, though her expression suggested some wariness about what might be coming. "Do you think there will ever be a time when my presence in this family won't require special consideration or management? When I can simply participate as Charles's wife without everyone having to calculate the potential complications?" The question was more vulnerable than anything else Camilla had said during their conversation. It revealed not just her frustration with the current situation, but her deeper longing for genuine acceptance and belonging within the royal family, and was quiet for a long moment, and Camilla could see her wrestling with how to respond honestly without being either cruel or falsely reassuring. "I think," and said finally, "that change takes time, and some people will always find it more difficult than others. But I also think that the conversations we're planning to have might help some people understand that their concerns are based more on assumptions than on reality." It wasn't a complete answer, but it was more honest and hopeful than Camilla had expected. She found herself appreciating Anne's willingness to acknowledge the complexity of the situation without making promises she couldn't keep. The remainder of their visit passed more smoothly, with the conversation shifting to logistical details about the upcoming discussions and practical considerations about the memorial service planning. By the time Anne prepared to leave, the atmosphere between the three of them had evolved from adversarial to cautiously cooperative. As they stood in the entrance hall, saying their goodbyes, and turned to address Camilla directly one final time, "I want you to know that my concerns today weren't personal attacks on you or your marriage to Charles. I hope you understand that I was trying to address real challenges in a way that would be fair to everyone involved." Camilla nodded, recognizing the olive branch that was being extended. "I appreciate your honesty about the situation, and I'm grateful for your willingness to ensure that we have a voice in resolving these issues." After Anne's departure, Charles and Camilla found themselves alone in their sitting room, both emotionally drained from the intensity of the afternoon's conversation. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the room and creating an atmosphere that felt both peaceful and melancholy. "Well," Charles said with a tired smile, settling into his chair beside Camilla, "that was certainly more eventful than I expected." Camilla reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that had become automatic after so many years together. "Do you think we handled it well? I keep wondering if I should have said more, or less, or something different entirely." "I think you were remarkable," Charles replied without hesitation. "You showed more grace and wisdom in that conversation than most people could manage under much less pressure." They sat together in comfortable silence for several minutes, both processing what had occurred and considering what lay ahead. The conversation with and had resolved some immediate questions while raising others, and both of them understood that the real work was just beginning. "Charles," Camilla said eventually, "what do you think will happen in these discussions and is planning to arrange?" He considered the question carefully before responding. "I think we'll discover who our real allies are within the family and the institution, and I think some people might surprise us, both positively and negatively." As evening fell around them, both Charles and Camilla understood that they were facing a turning point in their life together. The challenges ahead would test not only their relationship with other family members, but their own resilience and commitment to each other. Whatever the outcome of the upcoming discussions, they would face it together, just as they had faced every other challenge in their long and complex journey toward happiness and acceptance. 2 weeks had passed since Anne's visit, and the atmosphere at Clarence House remained tense despite everyone's best efforts to maintain normalcy. Charles found himself checking his phone repeatedly for updates about the family meeting and had promised to arrange, while Camilla threw herself into her charitable work with an intensity that revealed her underlying anxiety about the upcoming discussions. The call came on a gray Tuesday morning while Charles was reviewing correspondence in his study. His private secretary knocked discreetly before entering, carrying a telephone with an expression that suggested the call was significant. "Your Royal Highness, Princess, and is on the line. She says it's urgent regarding the family discussions you've been planning." Charles felt his stomach tighten as he accepted the phone, and rarely described anything as urgent unless it truly was, and he couldn't help but wonder what new complication had arisen. "And? What's happened?" His sister's voice sounded strained, lacking its usual confident authority. "Charles, we need to talk immediately. Something has come up that changes everything about our planned discussions." "What kind of something?" Charles asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "I can't discuss this properly over the phone. Can you and Camilla come to Gatcombe Park this afternoon? This is too important to wait for our scheduled meeting next week." The urgency in Anne's voice sent alarm bells ringing in Charles's head. Throughout their lives, his sister had been the steady, practical one who rarely allowed emotions to dictate her actions. Whatever had prompted this emergency summons must be significant indeed. "Of course we'll come," he replied without hesitation. "Should I be prepared for anything specific?" There was a pause on the other end of the line that lasted long enough to increase Charles's anxiety further. When Anne finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested she was struggling with how much to reveal. "Just prepare yourself for the possibility that our family situation is more complicated than any of us realized. I'll explain everything when you arrive." After ending the call, Charles sat staring at the phone for several minutes, trying to imagine what could have prompted such an urgent summons. The cryptic nature of Anne's comments only amplified his concerns, leaving him to wonder whether they were facing a new crisis or simply learning more details about the existing challenges. He found Camilla in her sitting room, surrounded by correspondence from various charitable organizations she supported. She looked up as he entered, and he could see that his expression immediately triggered her own anxiety. "What's wrong?" she asked, setting aside her letters and giving him her full attention. "And called. She wants us to come to Gatcombe Park immediately. Something urgent has come up regarding our family discussions." Camilla's face went pale, and Charles could see her hands beginning to tremble slightly. "What kind of urgent? Did she give you any details?" "Very few, unfortunately. She said our family situation is more complicated than we realized, but she couldn't explain over the phone." They spent the drive to Gatcombe Park in relative silence, both lost in their own thoughts and fears about what they might discover. The countryside passed by in a blur of autumn colors, normally a sight that would bring them both pleasure, but today they were too preoccupied to notice the beauty around them. Gatcombe Park had always been Anne's refuge, the place where she could escape the pressures of royal life and focus on her passion for horses and country living. But as their car pulled up to the main house, the property felt different somehow, less welcoming and more foreboding than Charles remembered from previous visits. And met them at the front door, and Charles was struck by how tired and stressed she appeared. The Princess Royal was typically immaculate in her presentation, but today her hair seemed hastily arranged, and there were lines of tension around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she said, ushering them inside with none of her usual formal courtesy. "We need to talk privately. I've asked the staff to give us complete privacy." They settled in Anne's private study, a comfortable room lined with books and photographs that reflected her various interests and achievements. But the cozy atmosphere did nothing to ease the tension that seemed to fill every corner of the space. And Charles said gently, recognizing that his sister was struggling with whatever information she needed to share. "Whatever this is about, we can handle it. Just tell us what's happened." And moved to her desk and retrieved a manila folder that she handled with the care typically reserved for dangerous objects. "Yesterday, I received some information that explains a great deal about the resistance we've been encountering regarding Camilla's role in family events." She opened the folder and withdrew what appeared to be several documents and photographs. Charles felt Camilla tense beside him and arranged the materials on the coffee table between them. It turns out that our concerns about unnamed family members and institutional advisors were only part of the story. There's been a coordinated effort to limit Camilla's visibility and influence within the royal family, and it goes much deeper than any of us suspected. Charles leaned forward to examine the documents, his confusion quickly transforming into anger as he began to understand what he was seeing. The papers appeared to be communications between various palace officials, distant family members, and even some media contacts, all discussing strategies for managing what they termed the Camilla problem. "Where did you get these?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "That's not important right now," Anne replied. "What matters is what they reveal about the organized nature of the opposition you've been facing." Camilla reached for one of the documents with a shaking hand, scanning its contents with growing horror. The clinical language couldn't disguise the personal nature of the attacks being planned against her. These weren't simply concerns about protocol or tradition. They were calculated attempts to undermine her position and isolate her from family activities. "Some of these communications go back years," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "They've been planning this for years." Charles's face had gone white with rage as he absorbed the implications of what they were seeing. These aren't random concerns from well-meaning family members. This is a conspiracy. The word hung in the air between them, stark and shocking in its accuracy. What they had believed to be isolated incidents of disapproval or resistance were actually part of a systematic campaign to prevent Camilla from achieving full acceptance within the royal family. "Who's behind this?" Charles demanded, his protective instincts fully engaged. "I want names, Anne. I want to know exactly who has been orchestrating this campaign against my wife." And hesitated, clearly reluctant to provide the specific information Charles was demanding. "Charles, knowing the details won't necessarily help us resolve the situation. What we need to focus on is how to move forward from here." "Don't protect them," Charles said sharply. "If people have been actively working to undermine my marriage and hurt my wife, I have a right to know who they are." The silence stretched uncomfortably as Anne wrestled with her loyalties. Finally, she withdrew another document from the folder and placed it before her brother. "The coordination seems to center around a group that includes some distant cousins, a few long-serving palace officials, and—" She paused, clearly struggling with the final revelation, "someone much closer to home than we might have expected." Charles studied the document she had provided, and as the names became clear, his expression shifted from anger to shocked disbelief. Among the correspondence was communication from someone whose involvement in such a campaign seemed almost impossible to believe. "This can't be right," he said slowly, reading and rereading the evidence before him. "Surely this person wouldn't." "I had the same reaction when I first saw it," and replied quietly. "But the evidence is quite clear. This isn't a mistake or a misunderstanding." Camilla looked between the siblings, seeing the shock and pain in both their faces, but unable to bring herself to examine the documents that were causing such distress. "Who is it?" she asked quietly. "Who has been working so hard to keep me excluded?" Charles turned to look at her, and she could see that whatever he had discovered had shaken him to his core. When he spoke, his voice was filled with hurt and disbelief. "It appears that someone we trusted, someone we considered a close ally within the family, has been actively participating in efforts to limit your role and influence." The betrayal was clearly devastating for Charles, and Camilla felt her heart breaking for him, even as she struggled to process her own feelings about this revelation. To discover that their challenges weren't simply the result of institutional resistance or family traditions, but were actually the product of deliberate sabotage, was almost too much to comprehend. "I need to understand why," Charles said, turning back to Anne. "What could possibly motivate someone to act this way? What do they hope to accomplish?" and had clearly been preparing for this question, but she still seemed to struggle with how to explain the motivations behind such a campaign. For what I can determine, there are several factors at work. Some people genuinely believe that maintaining distance between Camilla and high-profile family events protects the institution from potential controversy. Others seem to be motivated by more personal considerations, old grievances, concerns about precedent, or simple resistance to change. And some people, she continued reluctantly, appear to believe that if they can make Camilla's position uncomfortable enough, she might choose to step back from public life voluntarily. The cruelty of this final motivation hit Camilla like a physical blow. The idea that people were deliberately trying to make her life miserable in hopes that she would simply disappear was both shocking and deeply hurtful. "They want me to leave," she said quietly, the words coming out as more of a statement than a question. "Some of them, yes," and confirmed gently. "They seem to believe that your withdrawal from public life would resolve what they see as ongoing complications for the family." Charles stood abruptly and began pacing around the room, his anger and frustration evident in every movement. "This is unconscionable. These people have no right to make decisions about our lives or our marriage. They certainly have no right to conduct campaigns designed to drive my wife away from her own family." Charles, and said carefully, "I understand your anger, and it's completely justified. But we need to think strategically about how to respond to this situation. Acting purely on emotion could make things worse for everyone. Worse than discovering that people we trusted have been actively working against us for years." Charles replied sharply, "I'm not sure how much worse things could get." Camilla had been sitting quietly during this exchange, processing not just the immediate shock of these revelations, but their broader implications for her life and relationship with Charles. When she finally spoke, her voice was surprisingly steady. "I need to see all of it," she said firmly. "If there are other documents or communications that involve me, I want to know exactly what's been said and done." Both Charles and turned to look at her in surprise. Throughout the afternoon's revelations, Camilla had seemed shocked and hurt, but now there was a note of determination in her voice that suggested a fundamental shift in her approach to these challenges. "Camilla," and said gently, "some of these materials are quite harsh. You might prefer to let Charles and me handle the details while you focus on moving forward." "No," Camilla replied with growing conviction. "I've spent too many years allowing other people to make decisions about my life without my input. If people have been discussing me and planning strategies to limit my role in this family, I want to know exactly what they've said." Charles moved to sit beside her, reaching for her hand in a gesture of support. "Are you sure? Some of this material is quite personal and potentially very hurtful." "I'm sure," Camilla replied without hesitation. "I can't make informed decisions about how to respond to this situation if I don't understand the full scope of what we're facing," and nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in Camilla's request despite her protective instincts. Over the next hour, she carefully walked them through the various documents and communications, explaining the context and relationships that had produced such an extensive campaign of resistance. As the full picture emerged, all three of them began to understand that they were facing challenges far more complex and deeply rooted than any of them had previously realized. The memorial service controversy that had prompted their initial family discussion was just the latest manifestation of a much larger and more systematic effort to control Camilla's role within the royal family. The question now, and said as they neared the end of her presentation, is what we're going to do with this information. Do we confront the people involved directly? Do we try to work through institutional channels? Do we simply proceed with our original plans and ignore the opposition? Charles looked at his wife, seeking her input before responding. Throughout their marriage, he had learned to value her insights and perspective, particularly when they were facing difficult decisions about their shared life. "What do you think, darling? How do you want to handle this?" Camilla was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing their options carefully. When she finally spoke, her words surprised both her husband and his sister. "I think," she said slowly, "that it's time for me to stop trying to earn acceptance from people who have already decided that I'm not worthy of it. And I think it's time for us to make our own decisions about how we participate in family life, regardless of what others might prefer." The strength and resolve in her voice marked a significant transformation from the anxious woman who had sat in their drawing room 2 weeks earlier, worried about Anne's concerns regarding the memorial service. These revelations, as painful as they were, had apparently clarified something important for Camilla about her own position and priorities. "You're talking about taking a more assertive approach?" Anne asked, though her tone suggested she was intrigued rather than concerned by this possibility. "I'm talking about taking an authentic approach," Camilla replied. "I'm tired of trying to make myself smaller or less visible to accommodate other people's discomfort. If Charles and I are going to honor your mother's memory, we should do it in a way that reflects our genuine love and respect for her, not in a way that's been dictated by people who are more concerned with managing perceptions than honoring relationships." As the afternoon drew toward evening, the three of them began to discuss practical strategies for moving forward in light of these new revelations. The conversation was no longer about whether Camilla would participate fully in family events, but about how they would handle the opposition they now knew they were facing. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would meet them with a clearer understanding of the forces arrayed against them and a stronger sense of their own values and priorities. The painful revelations of this afternoon had actually provided them with something unexpected, the clarity and resolve they needed to chart their own course forward, regardless of who might prefer that they choose differently. The conspiracy against Camilla had been designed to weaken her position within the royal family. Instead, it had strengthened her determination to claim her rightful place beside the man she loved, no matter what obstacles others might place in their path. The morning of the confrontation arrived with an unseasonable warmth that seemed at odds with the gravity of what lay ahead. Charles stood at his bedroom window, watching the early mist rise from the gardens while Camilla prepared for what they both knew would be one of the most significant days of their marriage. 3 days had passed since their meeting with and at Gatcombe Park. 3 days of careful planning and strategic discussions about how to address the conspiracy they had uncovered. During that time, Charles had experienced a range of emotions that left him feeling alternately furious, hurt, and determined to protect the woman he loved from further attacks. "Are you certain about this approach?" Camilla asked from across the room, where she was putting the finishing touches on her appearance for the day ahead. Her voice was steady, but Charles could detect the underlying tension that she was working hard to control. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," he replied without hesitation. "These people have carried out a deliberate campaign to undermine our marriage and exclude you from family life. They've done it secretly, without giving us any opportunity to address their concerns directly. That ends today." The plan they had developed was straightforward in its boldness. Rather than allowing the conspirators to continue operating in shadows, they would force a direct confrontation by calling an emergency family meeting and presenting the evidence and had uncovered. Charles had spent considerable time deciding exactly who should be included in this gathering, ultimately settling on a group that included both the key figures behind the resistance and several family members whose support they could count on. "Your Highness," Charles's private secretary entered the room with his usual discreet knock. "The family members have been contacted and confirmed for this morning's meeting. Princess Anne has also confirmed that she has the documentation ready to present." Charles nodded, feeling a familiar surge of gratitude for his sister's willingness to support them in this difficult situation. Despite her initial role as messenger for the opposition, and had proven herself a true ally once the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. "And the location arrangements?" Charles asked. "Everything has been prepared at Windsor, sir. The room will provide complete privacy, and security has been briefed to ensure no interruptions." After his secretary departed, Charles moved to where Camilla was standing and placed his hands gently on her shoulders. In the mirror's reflection, he could see the determination in her eyes, mixed with the vulnerability she was trying so hard to conceal. "Camilla," My darling, if at any point during this meeting you feel overwhelmed or want to leave, you must tell me immediately. I won't allow anyone to treat you with disrespect, regardless of their position or relationship to our family." She turned to face him directly, reaching up to adjust his tie in a gesture that had become automatic during their years together. "Charles, I appreciate your protective instincts, but I need you to trust that I can handle whatever happens today. These people have been making decisions about my life without my presence for far too long. It's time for me to face them directly." The strength in her voice reassured him, but he could also see the effort it took for her to maintain such composure. The revelations about the organized opposition to her role in the family had been devastating, but they had also awakened something fierce and determined within her that Charles had rarely seen before. The drive to Windsor passed in contemplative silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts about what the next few hours might bring. As their car approached the castle, Charles found himself reflecting on how dramatically their understanding of their family situation had changed in just a few days. For years, they had attributed the resistance they encountered to general institutional conservatism or individual personality conflicts. Learning that much of their difficulty stemmed from deliberate sabotage had been shocking, but it had also provided them with a clear target for their response. Today's meeting would determine whether they could resolve these issues within the family or whether more drastic measures might be necessary. The family members began arriving at Windsor shortly after 10 o'clock in the morning. Charles watched from a window as various cars deposited their passengers, trying to read body language and expressions for clues about what each person might be thinking or feeling about this unexpected summons. Some family members appeared genuinely puzzled by the urgent meeting, while others seemed nervous or defensive in ways that suggested they might have some inkling of what was to come. And arrived precisely on time, carrying herself with a military bearing that had served her well in countless difficult situations throughout her royal career. When everyone had assembled in the private meeting room, Charles took his position at the head of the table with Camilla beside him. The arrangement was deliberate, a visual statement about their united front and equal participation in addressing the family's concerns. "Thank you all for adjusting your schedules to attend this emergency meeting," Charles began, his voice carrying the authority that came naturally to him in formal situations. "What we need to discuss today is both urgent and deeply personal, involving not just our immediate family relationships, but the fundamental principles that guide how we treat each other." He paused to make eye contact with each person around the table, noting the varying expressions of curiosity, concern, and, in some cases, barely concealed apprehension. 3 days ago, we discovered evidence of a coordinated campaign to limit my wife's participation in family events and undermine her position within our royal household. This campaign has been ongoing for several years and involves multiple individuals who are present in this room today. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Several family members began speaking at once, some expressing shock and demanding details, while others became noticeably defensive. Charles allowed the initial outburst to continue for a few moments before raising his hand for silence. "Before anyone attempts to deny or minimize what has occurred, I want you to see exactly what we've uncovered," and stood and began distributing copies of the documents they had reviewed together at Gatcombe Park. As family members examined the evidence, the room gradually fell silent except for the rustle of papers and occasional sharp intakes of breath as people recognized their own communications among the materials. Charles watched carefully as each person absorbed the information, noting who appeared genuinely surprised and who seemed more focused on damage control than shock at the revelations. The distinction between those who had been involved and those who had been kept in the dark became increasingly clear. "I don't understand," said one of the younger family members, looking up from the documents with genuine confusion. "Why wasn't this discussed openly if there were concerns about protocol or tradition?" "Because this was never about legitimate protocol concerns," Camilla said, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. Her voice was calm, but carried an edge that commanded attention. This was about a group of people deciding that my marriage to Charles was problematic and working systematically to make my life difficult enough that I might choose to withdraw from family life entirely. The directness of her statement seemed to shock several people around the table. For years, Camilla had maintained a carefully diplomatic approach to family conflicts, always seeking to avoid confrontation or controversy. Today's willingness to speak so bluntly marked a significant departure from her usual strategy. One of the palace officials whose communications were featured prominently in the evidence cleared his throat nervously before speaking. "Your Royal Highnesses, I think there may be some misunderstanding about the intent behind these discussions. The concerns raised were always focused on what might be best for the institution rather than any personal considerations." "What's best for the institution," Charles replied sharply, "is honesty, integrity, and respect for the marriages and commitments that family members make to each other. Conducting secret campaigns to undermine those relationships serves no legitimate institutional purpose." The confrontation that followed was unlike anything the royal family had experienced in recent memory. Years of suppressed grievances, hidden resentments, and carefully managed conflicts finally erupted into open discussion. Some family members defended their participation in the resistance campaign, arguing that they had been motivated by genuine concerns about tradition and public perception. Others expressed shock at learning about the coordinated nature of the opposition and distanced themselves from the more extreme aspects of the campaign. The room gradually divided into clear factions: those who supported Charles and Camilla's right to participate fully in family life, and those who believed that certain limitations were necessary for the good of the institution. What I find most disturbing, and interjected during a particularly heated exchange, is not that people had concerns about change or tradition, but that they chose to address those concerns through deception and manipulation rather than honest conversation. Her words carried particular weight, given her initial role in conveying the family's resistance to Camilla's memorial service participation. Having and explicitly condemned the methods used by the opposition provided Charles and Camilla with a powerful ally whose royal credentials were unquestionable. As the morning progressed, the conversation gradually shifted from defensive justifications to practical discussions about how to move forward. Some family members who had been involved in the resistance campaign began to acknowledge that their methods had been inappropriate, even if they maintained that their concerns had been legitimate. "The question now," said one of the senior family members who had remained largely silent during the confrontations, "is whether we can find a way to address these issues that respects everyone's perspectives while ensuring that Charles and Camilla are treated fairly." "With respect," Camilla replied, "I'm no longer interested in compromises that require me to make myself smaller or less visible to accommodate other people's discomfort. If people have concerns about my participation in family events, I'm willing to discuss those concerns openly. But I won't accept secret campaigns or behind-the-scenes efforts to limit my role." The strength and clarity of her position seemed to surprise several people around the table. But Charles could see that it also earned her a measure of respect that had been lacking in previous family interactions. By refusing to accept victim status and instead demanding equal treatment, Camilla was fundamentally changing the dynamics of their family relationships. The meeting continued into the afternoon, with various family members taking turns to express their perspectives and commitments to more open communication in the future. Some offered genuine apologies for their participation in the resistance campaign, while others maintained their positions but agreed to address future concerns through direct discussion rather than secret coordination. By late afternoon, they had reached what could generously be called a resolution. While not everyone was entirely satisfied with the outcome, all parties had agreed to several key principles. Future concerns about family events or protocol will be discussed openly rather than through behind-the-scenes campaigns. Camilla's participation in family activities will be determined through direct conversation with Charles rather than by committee decisions. And any family member who felt unable to treat Camilla with appropriate respect would be expected to excuse themselves from events rather than attempting to exclude her. As the meeting concluded and family members began to depart, Charles felt a complex mixture of relief, exhaustion, and cautious optimism about what they had accomplished. The confrontation had been painful and emotionally draining, but it had also cleared the air in ways that years of diplomatic maneuvering had failed to achieve. "How do you feel?" he asked Camilla as they watched the last cars disappear down the castle drive. "Tired," she admitted, leaning against him for support, "but also strangely liberated. For the first time in years, I feel like I know exactly where I stand with everyone in the family. There's something to be said for that kind of clarity, even when it's uncomfortable," and approached them as they prepared for their own departure, her expression mixing pride with lingering concern about the day's events. "You both handled that remarkably well," she said sincerely. "I know today was difficult, but I think it was necessary. Some of those conversations should have happened years ago." And Charles said, reaching out to clasp his sister's shoulder, "I can't thank you enough for your support through all of this. I know it wasn't easy for you to bring us this information or to stand with us today. Family loyalty works both ways," and replied simply, "If people are going to claim that their actions are motivated by protecting the family, they should be prepared to treat family members with honesty and respect." As they drove home to Clarence House, Charles and Camilla reflected on how dramatically their situation had changed in the span of just a few hours. The secret opposition that had plagued them for years was now out in the open, and they had faced their critics directly rather than continuing to wonder about unnamed sources of resistance. "Do you think this will really change things?" Camilla asked as they approached their home. "I think," Charles replied carefully, "that we've established some important boundaries about how we're willing to be treated. Whether that translates in a lasting change will depend on how seriously people take the commitments they made today." That evening, as they sat together in their private sitting room, both Charles and Camilla felt the exhaustion that comes after intense emotional confrontation. But they also felt something they hadn't experienced in years: the peace that comes from no longer having to wonder about hidden opposition or secret campaigns against their relationship. The memorial service for the Queen Mother was held 3 weeks later, with Camilla participating fully in both the planning and the ceremony itself. Her presence was noted by the media and public, but without the controversy that the resistance campaign had hoped to generate. The family gathered to honor their beloved matriarch, and for the first time in years, personal politics took a back seat to genuine grief and remembrance. In the months that followed, the new dynamics established during their confrontational family meeting gradually settled into a more sustainable pattern. Some relationships remained strained, but the poisonous atmosphere of secret opposition had been replaced by honest, if sometimes difficult, direct communication. Camilla found herself approaching family events with a confidence she had never possessed before, knowing exactly where she stood with each family member, even when that position was uncomfortable, proved to be far more manageable than the constant uncertainty she had previously endured. Charles, meanwhile, discovered that defending his marriage openly rather than trying to manage everyone's sensitivities had strengthened both his relationship with Camilla and his own sense of personal integrity. The man who had spent much of his life trying to avoid conflict had learned that some battles were worth fighting, particularly when they involved protecting the people he loved most. The conspiracy that had been designed to drive them apart had ultimately brought them closer together and given them the clarity they needed to build the life they wanted, regardless of who might prefer they choose differently. In facing their opponents directly, they had discovered reserves of strength and determination that would serve them well in all the challenges that lay ahead. Their love story, which had begun in shadows and uncertainty, had finally emerged into the light of honest acknowledgement and mutual respect. Not everyone would ever fully accept their relationship, but those who mattered most had learned to treat it with the dignity it deserved. For Charles and Camilla, that was more than enough to build a future upon.